So I was born and raised in Spokane, Washington, in an American-Italian Catholic family. I attended Catholic school with the nuns, like Barb, for 12 years. And when I was 19, I had a crisis of faith. I don't remember totally what it was about, but one of the issues was having to go to a priest to confess my sins. I couldn't get that. And a priest I respected could not answer my questions in any way that satisfied. So I left the church and never imagined darkening the doors of a church again, except maybe family weddings and funerals. In my 20s, in the 1970s, I became quite a follower of what was then called the human potential movement, the fields of psychology, personal development, holistic health, and a more new age type of spirituality. And that became my religion of sorts. In 1977, I participated in a program on Cortez Island at the Cold Mountain Institute. It's the precursor to the Hollyhock Institute. And this resulted in my immigration to Canada and Vancouver. In 1995, I went through a divorce, which was one of the most difficult experiences of my life. It kind of broke me, and I remember a person I went to for help telling me to pray, which I thought was ridiculous. The only God I knew of was the Catholic God of my childhood, and I wanted nothing to do with that. But I think inside there was a still small voice that was crying for help in spite of myself. What I felt really saved me during that time, though, was nature. I spent hours and days hiking, riding my bike, and jogging the Falls Creek seawall until I could get to Kitts Beach and see the horizon, and that was my source of faith. By 1999, I'd gotten through the grief, had met Larry, my husband, and I decided I really wanted to give back to the natural world, which I felt had saved me. And so I started volunteering at the David Suzuki Foundation. And my job at the foundation was to archive their video library, which meant that I sat in the boardroom watching hours upon hours of clear-cut logging and sobbing my eyes out. And I kept thinking about a paper I'd read in graduate school called Despair and Empowerment in the Nuclear Age by a woman named Joanna Macy. I didn't know who Joanna Macy was, but her words, despair and empowerment, kept haunting me because I certainly had the despair part, but where was the empowerment? So one day I walked into the volunteer coordinator's office at the foundation, and there on his desk was Joanna Macy's memoir. And so I asked if I could borrow it, and shortly after that, I received my brochure from Hollyhock, and lo and behold, she was coming to Hollyhock to give a workshop. The week before her course, Matthew Fox was coming to Hollyhock. A little crossover here, Barb. And he was giving a workshop. And I'd always been curious about him, as Barb mentioned, and his concept of creation spirituality. So I signed up for both. And those 2 weeks were life-changing experiences for me. With Matthew, he described calling himself a panentheist, which he said means God is in everything and everything is in God. And I feel that I had what I would call a mystical experience on Cortez, chanting those words as I was riding my bike down the roads of Cortez Island, and those words became very real to me in a very profound way that has never left me. And that followed the workshop with Joanna, who is an eco-philosopher, a Buddhist practitioner, and an activist. And she leads groups all over the world in a process of helping people feel what they feel about what's happening on the planet, the despair part, but not to deaden those feelings, but also not to get stuck in them, and to help people move through them to a place of empowerment to participate in helping to heal the earth. And I thought, I saw in Joanna's work what I do as a psychotherapist all the time, and that I could apply those skills to the healing of our world. So Larry and I tootled on down to California and did a facilitator training with her. All this was great, but what I needed was a community of like-minded people, people who were interested in ecology and spirituality. And I don't know why I was led here. I remember reading an article about Bruce Sanguin in his church. I don't think it had anything to do with eco-spirituality, but I decided to come for a service, and I sat in the very back row so I could scoot out the door as quickly as possible. And I opened the bulletin, and Bruce was starting a series on eco-spirituality. So I thought, I gotta meet this guy. So I popped up at the end of service and went and introduced myself. And again, there's that still small voice. He asked if I wanted to come and join the group, and I heard this little voice inside say, "Just say yes, Toni." So I did, and the rest is history, as they say. So during those years, Bruce's preaching and teaching, as Barb mentioned, some of which had been influenced by Matthew Fox and others, really spoke to me. His theological orientation evolved into what he called evolutionary Christianity, which resonated with the spirit experience I had on Cortez Island, that God is in everything and everything is in God, and that consciousness is evolving, whether we are aware of it or not. And so I realized then that I needed to get on board with the evolution of consciousness along the lines of the teacher Teilhard de Chardin, as Barb mentioned. At that time, Russ Quinn was the leader of the environmental ministry here, and we were very involved in making physical changes at Canadian Memorial, but also putting on meetings and workshops around environmental issues. And so for a number of years, Larry and I led Joanna Macy-based retreats and workshops, often at the Quinn's homes, either in Whistler or on Paisley Island. So here I had found a spiritual home, a new way of understanding what God meant to me, a community of friends and fellow seekers, and a place to offer some of my skills. When Bruce left, however many years ago, that was a huge loss for me. He had become a friend, and we've stayed connected since then. But I really missed his innovative and creative way of thinking and teaching and preaching, and I still miss it. But what surprised me was how much this community meant to me and has continued to mean to me, and so I stayed. What I think was missing in those years with Bruce, though, was spiritual practice. And along came my dear friend Bob Russell and others who encouraged Beth to hold a meeting to see who among the congregation was also interested in developing ministries of sorts of spiritual practice. We didn't know how many people would be interested, and we're quite surprised when the fireside room was filled to the capacity and overflow. So several initiatives got formulated from that day, and Bob and I started our contemplative practice circles that, as you know, have been alive and well ever since, in some ways thanks to the pandemic and the convenience of Zoom technology. So I am grateful for these circles because Bob is a far more dedicated practitioner than I am. I really need these circles to keep me and support me in my practice, and so many others have said the same is true for them. So I am grateful to Canadian Memorial for this community, for the friends we have made here, for how we have evolved over these 20-plus years since the leadership of Bruce and Beth, and all the others who have taken the ethic of ministry by anyone, anytime, anywhere to heart, and have offered so many wonderful gifts to all of us. I remember years ago, the journalist Douglas Todd, who used to be a member here, he wrote a book about Cascadia and about how people in this part of the North America often identify as spiritual but not religious, which is really how I would have identified myself. And he said what was missing for people was community, and that is what we have here. So I'm excited to see where we're going from here with Reverend Jeff. I loved what he said in our interviews with him, that he thought the United Church is what people are looking for. They just don't know it. I didn't know it until I found my way here. And I'm excited to continue to help this community become an attractor to others, to find what David Ewart said to me he thought people were looking for was meaning and connection. And that is what I have found here. And I want to thank all of you for that. Thank you.